This video is going to give an introduction to homeostasis. It's also going to go over the first PowerPoint that we go through in class together, so that if you're absent or you want to go over it again, then it's a good opportunity for you to view it again. Okay, so what actually is homeostasis? Homeo is from the Greek, and that means to remain unchanging, and stasis is standing, or kind of like a state of being. So generally what homeostasis means is that it's a way of regulating the body or regulating a system so that it stays the same, okay? And if you look at lovely Wills in the center of the slide here, you can see that if we went and plonked him in Antarctica, up to a degree he would be okay, and he'd probably put some warm clothes on, but his body would undergo several changes that would allow his body to adapt to being in that cold environment. And in the same point of view, if we went and took him into the desert, into a very hot environment, his body would undergo some changes to allow him to cope with being in that kind of situation. Now, obviously, there are some extremes to this, and if you're exposed to extreme cold or extreme heat over long periods of time, then our bodies lose the ability to cope with that, and then we do suffer quite serious consequences from that, and you can die as well from exposure to those different systems. But this whole internal is basically looking at how does our body regulate ourselves so that we can cope with being in all of these different kinds of conditions. So it's like a way, as it says down the bottom, of keeping the status quo, or sort of maintaining this ability to stay the same. Okay, so we're now going to go and look at the PowerPoint that we'll be looking at in class. So this is just going through this first PowerPoint, and basically we're just giving a general overview as to how humans are maintaining this balance or this homeostasis within our bodies, and we're going to look at several different systems to do this as we go through the internal, but this introductory PowerPoint is just like a basic overview of what actually homeostasis is. So this illustration that you can see over on the right side of the page here, it just gives a really general overview of the different kind of ways that the human body is interacting with its environment. So some examples here are taking in of food and the excretion of waste that we don't need, taking in of oxygen and excretion of carbon dioxide, and basically how we use these things to generate respiration, carry out respiration, and then get rid of the waste products. Now, our bodies do this in quite varying environments. One of the great things about humans is that we are very adaptable to live in almost any environment, any circumstances on Earth. And part of the reason that we're so adaptable is that we have this mechanism called homeostasis. So it's basically the way that our bodies are adapted to maintain this physiological constancy. And that's a tricky way of just saying that the physiological processes that are carried out in our body are able to be maintained to be the same despite the external fluctuations, or despite these differences that are occurring in our environment outside of us. The organ systems are the parts of our body that maintain this, and we're going to start looking at this internal about different ways that our bodies can do this. A common theme that you will see occurring throughout all of the different homeostatic mechanisms that we look at are this control systems. So basically it's a way of saying that our bodies are going to have to be able to detect changes in the environment, and more specifically detect changes that the environment places into our bodies. So that's where the receptor comes in. The receptor is there to detect things that are changing. So a very general example is shown down the bottom here, where it might be that you are seeing something that you would like to touch, and so in this case the eye, specifically the rod or the cone cells which are in our retina, are detecting something, or are able to figure out or tell us how far away that object might be. The next step is the control center, and in this case, and in most of the cases that we're going to look at, the brain, and one specific region of the brain that we'll look at a little bit later called the hypothalamus, is the control center. And it's basically a way of saying that it's the part of the system that detects or is able to interpret the changes that are occurring, and it also can then make changes, so it can affect changes from this control center. The last part is the effector, and this is the part of the system that is actually going to elicit a response or make some changes to allow our bodies to deal with what we want it to do. And in this case, the muscle cells in the hand are actually going to contract or relax, and they will be the effector in this system of being able to move or actually do something. So just to summarize up again, we have a receptor, which is there to basically detect any changes that are occurring. We have a control center, which processes the changes and makes appropriate effector decisions, and the effector, which is actually going to be the part of the system that is producing a response to the stimulus in the first place. So over on the right, this is a very classic diagram in terms of physiology, and if you go on to university to study this further, you will see this coming up very frequently. But this is a very simplified or schematic way of showing how our body processes stimuli or changes and how it responds to it, okay? So this is a continuation of what we were looking at before, looking at a stimulus being detected, and the control center is down here, and then the effectors bring about a change. So we'll go through this in just a second. But basically, this is called a feedback system, and so it is a very common mechanism in our bodies in order that we can respond to our external environment. So as well as being able to detect the stimulus that happens to be occurring, whatever it may be, our body is able to respond to this by interpreting the stimulus and allowing our bodies to respond back to that. So our body systems are highly regulated by feedback systems. There are both positive and negative feedback systems, and we'll look at that shortly, but let's just go through this diagram together. So basically, this is referring directly to homeostasis, but it's saying that we might have a stimulus that disrupts the status quo, that disrupts the way that our body likes, the state that our body likes being in. And this could be a positive or a negative change, but it's something that is away from the normal. And so basically we have receptors in our body here that are monitoring the situation, that are controlling it. And if they detect that something is out of whack, if something has changed, then they send that information onto the control center. The control center receives the input, and it kind of translates it or makes sense of it, and makes an appropriate response. And that will then provide that response to the effectors that are actually going to make the change. The effectors make that change, and there is a response that alters the condition from what it was previously. This then feeds back up to where the receptors are detecting where everything is happening in the first place. And the receptors will check again, has this gone back exactly where it needs to be? Do we still need to have more changes occurring? Or are we okay if we come back to normal, and therefore this kind of stops this constant feedback? But it is a constant process. It's a constant cycling of checking to make sure that our bodies are running as they're meant to be, and that everything is kind of back to a baseline or appropriate level. The most common form of feedback in our bodies is what we call a negative feedback. And the reason that it's called a negative feedback is that it is basically taking our bodies back from a point of being away from a baseline, and it's taking it back down towards that baseline. So the reason that it's negative is because the feedback acts against the direction of the change. So for example, and we'll look at thermoregulation in a moment, but if we get very hot, so for example, in a hot environment, the stimulus might be that we are getting too warm, that our blood temperature is increasing. This series of going through receptors, detecting that change in temperature, providing that information to the control center, and then the effectors come about, and we'll look at exactly what those are in a moment. But that brings about a change, and what that will do is that will decrease the body temperature, so it will come back towards the baseline, and then we come back up here. Is the body temperature back where it's meant to be, or do we need to go another step throughout this cycle? Okay, so the negative feedback just means that it is going away from the direction that the change happened, be that an increase in something or a decrease in something, but it is combating the change to get back to a controlled sense of being. This is the most common form of feedback in the body. There are positive feedback as well, which can be where the positive feedback goes in the same direction as the stimulus rather than combating it. And the classic example is during childbirth, where you're wanting to get sort of dilation and muscles contracting happening greater and greater and greater. And so that is a form of positive feedback, but it is far, far less common in the body. Negative feedback is the type of feedback that we will be looking at for every single system that we look at. This is a diagram that you're going to be seeing a lot of. It's a very simplified diagram, but it shows you quite nicely that this whole process is a cycle, and it's a constant checking in to see where the body's at and if any changes need to be occurring. You can use this diagram as we go through the different systems, and you can apply this and you will come up with your own receptors or the own sensors that you're using for the different systems. What is the control center? What control center are we using? What is the effector? Okay, so this will be a very good slide to come back to when you're looking to make sense of the more complex systems that we look at. But let's go through it quickly together now. And so basically we're saying that we know the bodies are never going to be perfectly stable. They are constantly in flux. They are constantly changing. Sometimes we get an increase in that system. Sometimes we get a decrease. But regardless of whether it is increasing or decreasing, it's still an imbalance. It is not where it is supposed to be. And so it's not the increase or decrease that our body is specifically looking for. It is simply a change from the baseline. So you can imagine this is kind of like the baseline that we're looking at. So any changes that occur, they change this variable. Now they're saying variable here, but that could be body temperature, it could be glucose level, it could be level of carbon dioxide in our blood, it could be the amount of water that's in our body. So anything like that is being constantly monitored. These changes that occur to whichever variable we happen to be looking at, once again, they're detected by a particular receptor. The receptors change depending on what system we're looking at, and we will name these as we go through when we get up to the different systems. After that happens, this information is sent along an afferent pathway. Now, that's probably a new word for us, afferent. All it means is that it is going from the body up to the brain normally. So it's kind of, it's a directional pathway from the outside towards the inside, or from the periphery of the body up to the brain, because that's generally where the control center is, or there's a couple of differences that we'll look at as we get through this. The control center is going to interpret that information that is being sent to it, and it will make an appropriate programmed response, and that will send that information along the efferent pathway. So another new word means the opposite of afferent. So rather than going to the brain, this is going from the brain to the outside of the body, or to wherever it needs to be. The effector is going to be the part of the system that actually makes those changes, and we'll look at specifically those different ones as we go through. And finally, you get a response of the effector, and that's going to feed back into this imbalance and hopefully correct it and come back up to this baseline where it's meant to be. Now, if it doesn't get fully corrected the first time, the cycle will repeat, and there is a rechecking each time. And sometimes it might go too far, and so you will get another system of responses occurring to get it back in balance every time. So it's just that it's a constant ongoing check of every system in our body. The first example that we will look at is classic example of temperature control. So this is just likening, this is the system of a thermostat in your house. And so in your house, you might set your thermostat to be 20 degrees or 22 degrees or whatever temperature you want it to be at. Now, if your house gets warmer than that, that will kick the fan in order to cool things down, or it might even be a heat pump if you're looking to pump the heat out of the house. And if your house drops down below that temperature that you've set, a heating system will kick in to warm it back up. So in the same sense, our body has a very similar mechanism in order to keep it warm. So when we get too hot, we sweat, and you get beads of liquid forming on your skin, and when they evaporate off your skin, that actually promotes a cooling system. And you also feel like you need to take your layers off, so you're not wearing so many warm clothes, and that allows you to cool down as well. If we get cold, our body goes into different mechanisms, including shivering, and so your muscles are involuntarily contracting in order to warm you up, and you'll also feel obliged to try and huddle together and put some more warm clothes on. So we are going to look at thermoregulation in a bit more detail, but this is just kind of a basic comparison between this thermoregulation of a house through a thermostat, or the thermoregulation of our body through some different systems. This is just carrying on this example of thermoregulation, and basically introducing this idea that the hypothalamus in our body, which is that region in our brain that we came across in the plant and animals topic, is responsible for a lot of things, but including this regulation of temperature within our bodies. So our bodies have this set point of 36.7 degrees Celsius, and should our core temperature increase or decrease below that, then we have this coordinated response of our nervous system, and also through hormonal responses that basically bring our body back to its normal temperature. In the next PowerPoint that we go through, the next couple of lessons, we will be looking at thermoregulation in more detail, but this is just giving you a basic overview of the process. So another example of where homeostasis is occurring in our body is looking at the respiratory system, or basically looking at how our breathing is linked to cellular respiration. So as you all know, when we breathe out, when respiration is carried out, we produce CO2, carbon dioxide. And while some of this gets directly breathed out into our lungs after it's been transported there, not all of that happens immediately, and sometimes we will actually get carbon dioxide dissolving into our blood, into water, and forming this carbonic acid, which in turn can then dissociate and form hydrogen ions. Okay, so these hydrogen ions are detected in our blood by chemoreceptors, and they're in the brain as well, and they keep an eye on the pH of the blood, basically. So if we're getting too many hydrogen ions being dissolved in the blood, the pH is going to increase. This sends a signal up to the brain, which will then increase our breathing rate. And so increasing our breathing rate means that we are going to effectively be able to expel more carbon dioxide, and therefore that will drop down the level of carbonic acid in our blood, and the pH will come back to a more acceptable level. So we're actually not going to look at the respiratory system in too much more detail than this, but it's just one more example of how our body is regulating this buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood. These are the three examples of the negative feedback systems that we're actually going to look at in a lot more detail. The first one will be thermoregulation that we're going to look at, and we've touched on that a little bit already. Another one will be blood glucose, so how our body makes sure that the level of glucose in our blood is maintained at an appropriate level, that we don't have these big fluctuations of glucose in our blood when we eat and things like that. And osmoregulation is looking at how our kidneys in particular regulate the level of water that is within our blood. So to make sure that when we're drinking and getting liquid from food, that we're not overwhelming our system with the liquid that's inside it. In this unit, we're also going to come across the endocrine system. So this is probably a new word for most of you guys. So endocrine is a system that is a collection of organs that produce chemical molecules, for example, hormones. And so it's just the way that this system in our body acts together to control our bodies using hormones. And some examples of glands that are found, so rather than calling them organs, these are all called glands in our bodies. Thyroid gland up around our neck and our throat, very important in terms of regulating metabolism and food and digestion and things like that, and how quickly these types of digestion reactions can be carried out. The adrenal gland, which is found just above the kidney in your back, is a bit hard to see with this diagram. And the adrenal glands are responsible for producing the hormones adrenaline. And the pancreas, which we should all be vaguely aware of in our gut. So we know that it is involved in digestion of food, but it is also very important in terms of producing hormones like insulin and glucagon, which are involved in glucose breakdown and glucose storage and things like that. And we know that we all have ovaries, and these, as well as generating eggs and releasing eggs, they also produce hormones like estrogen. And the testicles, which we do not have, but as well as producing sperm and releasing sperm, they're also involved in the production of testosterone, which is another reproductive hormone along with estrogen. So just a little bit more information about hormones, although we will look at these more specific ones as we go through this in turn altogether. But there's just some examples of hormones here. So basically hormones are chemicals that are produced by our bodies. They can be amino acids and single amino acids, although that's relatively uncommon. Peptides, proteins. So these are these kind of ones down here that you can see a more common regular form of. But they can also be fatty acids, they can be steroids, so they can have many different structures to them. But our bodies are involved in producing these different hormones to carry out specific metabolic effects on target cells. So in other words, these hormones are very specific in their action. They only have one job, and they do that job. Once they've done their job, they are broken down and excreted. It's quite important that these hormones don't hang around forever, because if they continued to hang around and they didn't get broken down, then we would have an overregulation, as it were, an overstimulus of the different effects that they're causing. So if you can think about here, there's human growth hormone, which is a protein, and that obviously brings about growth, positive growth changes in cells, but we can't have that around all the time, because otherwise cells would grow out of control. So they're very highly regulated. Their release and their breakdown is very highly regulated. The endocrine cells, or the glands that we looked at before, each produce their own novel hormones, or their own unique set of hormones. So here's an example of them down here. And they secrete them into the bloodstream. The bloodstream takes those hormones to the target cells, where they can then have an effect upon those target cells according to what the hormone action is meant to be doing. However, even though these hormones are entering the bloodstream, they have such a specific action on very specific target cells that there is no worry that they're going to have an effect on cells that they're not meant to be acting on. So it's a very highly regulated system. You can see down the bottom here is an example of the plasma membrane with a very specific receptor on its cell surface. In this case, it's a hormone receptor, and the hormone binds to this receptor, which then brings about whatever action or whatever effect that hormone is meant to be carrying out. These receptors are very, very specific to each of the hormones, and therefore it acts like a specific docking system where only the hormones can act upon these specific receptors on these target cells. We are also going to be looking at a range of hormones, or a kind of a set of hormones called antagonistic hormones. So you may remember this back into year 10, where we were looking at antagonistic muscles. And antagonistic just means that these two things are acting against each other in opposite directions. A classic example that we'll be looking at as we go through this topic are these two hormones, insulin and glucagon. And they actually have completely opposite effects from each other, and we will look at how they do that later when we look at blood glucose. But the example here is that by releasing the hormone glucagon, it actually raises the blood glucose level, But the raising of this blood glucose level is going to stimulate insulin release. Insulin gets released here, and insulin causes the lowering of the blood glucose level. The lower blood glucose level then stimulates glucagon release. And you can see that it's just this constant cycle that is occurring in order to maintain glucose level at a very standard or a very baseline rate. So antagonistic hormones are just where one hormone is counteracted by another hormone that has the opposite effect of it. We will be also looking at aspects of the nervous system, because the nervous system is highly involved in regulating homeostatic responses. There's 3 different aspects we're going to look at. So there's just some examples here, and we will talk about these in more detail. The central nervous system is basically the brain and the spinal cord. So that's the only 2 sort of aspects that are involved in the central nervous system. So central just being middle, or obviously central part of it. Peripheral nervous system, periphery tends to mean the outside. And so in this case, these sensory or the motor nerves that are all running down towards the outside of our body, these tend to be the peripheral nervous system. They do connect to the central nervous system, and that is one of the ways that we can get sensory information, or we can send signals from the outside of the body back up to the brain. The last part of the nervous system that we'll be looking at is called the autonomic nervous system. This is not something that comes up very frequently, obviously for you guys so far, but we're going to be looking at how this is involved in homeostasis. So it's important that you have seen this word before, autonomic nervous system. This is the series or the system of nerves that are connected to the different organs in the body. So, for example, to the lungs, to the heart, we've got stomach and intestines here, pancreas. Oh, I don't know what that one is. We'll have to make a guess on that one. Colon down there, and reproductive organs and bladder and things like that as well. Okay, so and a way of looking at it is that that word looks like automatic. And so we have no control over these nerves in our body. We're not consciously thinking about controlling your breathing or your heart rate or anything like that. So this is the part of the nervous system that our brain carries out directly for us, and we have no control generally on these aspects of our nervous system. The hypothalamus is going to come up reasonably frequently, because for a lot of the systems that we look at, the hypothalamus is actually the control center in several different systems. It's in the very center of the brain. It's actually it looks like a little triangle in the brain. The reason that's called hypothalamus, hypo means below, and thalamus is this region in the brain here, which is like a relay center in the brain. So it is a way of communicating from the body up to the cortex of the brain. But the hypothalamus is also very important in terms of receiving sensory information, and also information from receptors that are within our body, in order to control, translate, integrate a lot of these reactions, and also trigger off effector reactions to maintain this balance of systems in our body. It's very involved in a lot of different systems, but a couple are named here. So, for example, temperature regulation, food and fluid intake, and in sleep regulation as well. And we know this one because it's the hypothalamus that is involved with our biological clocks in our body. If you remember the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, that is found within the hypothalamus there as well. So hopefully that's a little bit of repeated information rather than new information. One very important role of the hypothalamus is that it is not just there as a control center. It actually has the ability to secrete substances as well from these specialized neurons that are found within it. And so by doing that, it can actually link the endocrine system directly into the nervous system. And it does this, so the hypothalamus is up here, and directly below the hypothalamus we have the pituitary gland. And so the pituitary gland is also highly involved in secreting hormones, but the hypothalamus has this ability to kind of connect and pituitary gland to the nervous system as well. And this is also obviously just below it within the brain. So these neurosecretory cells are very important because not only are they nerve cells or neurons, but they also have the ability to secrete substances like hormones, and that means that they are then being tied directly into the endocrine system. But we will be looking at both the hypothalamus and the pituitary system in more detail. Okay, so this was just a run through this first PowerPoint that we're going to be looking at, and then we're going to move into looking at thermoregulation in a little bit more detail. We will then look at osmoregulation and also blood glucose as we go through this unit together. Hopefully it's going to be very interesting.